Welcome back, everyone. So, today we're going to be talking about cross text connections. These are questions where you have two passages, one from one author, and another passage where usually a second author comes in and they try to respond to the ideas presented by author one. There's a five-step process for solving these questions. The first step is reading text one and identifying its central idea or the main point. And you kind of want to write it down. You can jot it down in 4 to 6 words, or simply just like summarize it to yourself in your head. And then you can go ahead and read text two and identify its main point and write that down in 4 to 6 words, or you can summarize it to yourself in your head again. So really, we're running the procedure for a regular central detail or central idea question, but we're running it twice now on two different passages. And then, here's the key step, you want to find the relationship between them. So in most cases, it's some kind of disagreement. Usually, passage one will present an idea and passage two will present a slightly different idea. So there's some kind of disagreement or point of contention. Sometimes you might also have a partial agreement, or you might have an agreement with a different emphasis. For example, passage one might claim something, and then passage two might come in and they might agree with that base premise, but they might think that, okay, passage one wants to emphasize or wants to focus on this aspect, but I want to focus on a different aspect. But maybe the fundamental premise is the same. Or sometimes they might partially agree. They might say, okay, I agree this part, I agree with this bit, this bit, this bit, but then they go on to present their own argument and present where they actually differ. So there's different kinds of relationships. A lot of the times you'll see that passage one will draw a smaller horizon essentially. That passage one will kind of have a narrower view, and then passage two will often jump in, the author jumps in, and they say, okay, I'm not saying this is necessarily wrong completely what passage one is saying, but here, let me draw a bigger circle around the circle that passage one drew, and just expanding the horizon essentially, and we're including more cases, more exceptions that are not covered by passage one. And for these questions, it's always a good practice to answer the question in your own words before you look at the answer choices, so you kind of have an intuition for what the correct answer should look like, so you don't get easily misguided by their answer choices, one of their early answer choices. And finally, you want to read the answer choices, of course, and you want to find the closest match using process of elimination. So just see which ones actually present the arguments correctly, which ones have the correct relationship, and so on. Um, a lot of the times, your answer choices will be primarily based on passage two. It's a pretty common case. There are some cases where you might see a mix or synthesis of both, or more from passage one. But usually, if the question is asking you how the author two would react to author one, they want to pull from author two's argument, which is in passage two. So naturally, a lot of the times, answer choices will refer a lot back to the passage two. The three relationship types. Uh, One is disagree. That's where they have like almost completely conflicting views. Text one argues X, and text two argues not X. And in this case, you wanna eliminate any positive or neutral answers. So if they say, okay, they both agree on this, then no, go ahead and cross that out. Same with neutral. If they say, oh, actually, they don't disagree, maybe one of them is talking about one thing and the other one is talking about something else. That's not true because they're talking about the same thing and they just have different, like exact opposite stances. Finally, this is the most common relationship type, so you want to get very, very good at solving these. Now, a more rare type is actually when they partially agree or agree. A full agreement is honestly really rare. I remember seeing one passage where they had a speech from someone from the suffrage movement all the way back in the 1920s, and then the second passage was kind of someone reacting, a modern author reacting to that speech in passage one, and kind of like talking about the legacy of that speech or the impact that speech had. Um, So in those cases, maybe you can consider that as like a full agreement or really just a reflection. But usually there will be some kind of partial agreement. So they might share some common ground. Like I said, they might share the premise, but then they might diverge in terms of what they emphasize, or they might agree partially, but then sometimes one might have just like a wider horizon. So they're agreeing with what one of them is saying, but they're also saying that's not really the full picture. So that also counts as kind of a partial agreement. And in these cases, you want to eliminate purely positive or purely negative answers. So if it's too positive, then you don't want to pick that because clearly there is still some kind of nuance that's being added, that's being contributed by author 2, or things that they think author 1 should consider, reconsider, or look into. And if it's purely negative, that's also not true just because there is some kind of agreement we can see. And both texts must be represented in that answer. So in terms of disagreement, a lot of the times you'll see only the second one represented just because it's saying how would author 2 react to author 1, and usually they would say author 2 would argue this, and the argument is presented in passage 2, so it's basically that argument from passage 2. Whereas if there's a partial agreement, then both must be represented, because then you'll see it's something like, okay, they both agree on this common ground, but passage 1 focuses on this and passage 2 focuses on that. So when you're trying to show a kind of a partial agreement, you have to show what they have in common, and then you also have to show what they don't have in common. So it has to refer both passages. So some different kinds of error. You might have a scope error where the answer is more general or specific than what the text argues. So again, it's just like a hasty generalization. You don't want to generalize too far. You want to stay within the bounds of the text. One text error is where it reflects one text, but it just like completely ignores the other. It just pretends like the other one doesn't exist. Like I said, sometimes it might refer or it might be primarily based on one of them, but it still has to kind of acknowledge the existence of both passages. If you have extreme languages like always, never, all, none, those are usually almost always wrong, just because it's too extreme. And finally, a fabricated connection. It invents a relationship that just doesn't exist, that the author doesn't state or imply. We can do a practice question here. Text 1 says researcher Fowler argues requiring citizens to vote leads to significant increase in voters who would otherwise not vote, thus better representing the population. Text 2 says Singh and Roy note that people forced to vote often choose randomly, not reflecting true preferences. So how would they like to respond to text 1? So again, we can summarize the arguments. Fowler is saying that it makes people who wouldn't vote, so your turnout is better or your population representation is better. That's the argument. And the second passage is saying that, okay, if these people clearly don't want to vote, and you force them and they just vote for random candidates, that doesn't reflect the true preferences of the people, so that's kind of just like bad data. You're just like adding noise to the data. So they're kind of disagreeing, and Singh and Roy just saying that just because you have more voters or you have more representation doesn't mean it's better representation or it's a true representation. That's kind of how I would describe that connection. So again, I haven't looked at the answer choices yet, but let's see. A, only countries of a certain size should implement mandatory voting, completely irrelevant. None of them talk about country size. People forced to vote are likely to become politically engaged in other ways. Are likely to become politically engaged in other ways. Again, they don't talk about political engagement in other ways. Completely irrelevant. C, requiring people to vote does not necessarily lead to election outcomes that better represent the whole country. That's exactly what they're saying, because here they said more people are voting, so it's a better representation of the country. But Singh and Roy is saying, but if they're just picking random candidates, then it's just like you're adding noise to the data. So it's actually kind of almost a slightly worse representation. And D, countries that require voting must also make the process easier. Again, this is a policy proposition that is not proposed by either text 1 or text 2, so completely irrelevant. The golden rule is always summarize the text in one sentence before you read the question. You can write it down if you want to. and it's going to always ask about the relationship between those two. So start connecting those passages, kind of seeing how they engage with each other as you're reading the passages and trying to come up with their summaries. As always, keep practicing, keep improving, and I'll see you in the next video.